welcome to Inside Bahrain. I'm Roshan Mohammed Salih. On Thursday, Bahrainis commemorated the second anniversary of the uprising that shook the tiny Persian Gulf nation to the core. So-called moderate opposition parties have entered into a national dialogue with the regime, but with a heavy heart, it seems. Meanwhile, the youth and the street seem to be increasingly intent on regime change rather than cosmetic reform. On the other hand, the Khalifa ruling family insists that it is best placed to lead the country on the path of national unity and economic prosperity. On today's show, we're going to look back at the events which mark the second anniversary of the Bahraini uprising and look ahead to the future. Where does Bahrain go from here? But first, here's a report rounding up this week's events.
Despite the Bahraini government's ban on protests, demonstrations against the Khalifa regime escalated ahead of the two-year anniversary of the uprising and leading up to the national reconciliation talks between the opposing camps. Not only did protests take place in the Persian Gulf nation, but they were also held across the globe, in London, Sweden, Berlin, Holland, America, and even Syria. The aim was, of course, to raise awareness about the situation in Bahrain and to express solidarity with the Bahraini people.
I want to support the people of Bahrain who are going through much more serious causes than this. They're in much more harder conditions, in tear gas and killing, and there's nothing like this here today. It's just the rain, and we can do that as long as we get the message across to the people.
Whilst the anti-regime protests took place around the world, the Bahraini government was preparing for national reconciliation talks that it claimed it would oversee but not contribute in. The Bahraini government also invited the nation to a celebration of national unity on the 14th of February. But protesters in Bahrain seemed unhappy about this, saying national unity in Bahrain is non-existent, so why should it be celebrated? Meanwhile, the Freedom of Expression group, IFEX, has issued a petition titled Calling the King to Allow Greater Openness in Bahraini Society. The petition asked the king to free all the human rights defenders, journalists and bloggers that are languishing in jail, some for life, simply for peacefully exercising their right to free expression and assembly.
We are supporting our Bahraini people and that we want freedom of speech, and they want us to hear us. We want them to hear us out and to know that we want freedom and that we need something, we need a change for Bahrain, and we're supporting the people and those people getting tortured.
On the second anniversary of the revolution, the opposition's message was clear. It opposes any step which entrenches tyranny and dictatorship and doesn't lead to real democratic transition. And the street protests will continue until their demands are met.
In the studio with me today, as usual, is Nawal Mohammed, who will be looking at what people have been saying about Bahrain on the social media sites. But first, let's speak to Dr. Saeed Shahabi, who's a Bahraini exile in London and the leader of the Bahrain Freedom Movement. Dr. Shahabi has been convicted in absentia of terrorism and has been sentenced to life in prison. He's also had his nationality taken away. Dr. Shahabi, before I ask you about the protests and the national dialogue, I'd like you to clear something up, because the Bahraini regime obviously accuses you of being, I quote, a London-based terror mastermind who glorifies acts of terror and sabotage, subverts national security, fuels sectarianism, and drives wedges between the nation. Your response to that?
Well, is there a tyrant in the world who would not accuse his opponents of such lies? But nobody listens to that. The regime knows that I am not that sort of person, and that's why it has called me and many times sent many people to ask me to go back. He asked me to meet the dictator. I met him twice. So if these attributes really are true, why should he sit with a terrorist, a mastermind, and so on?
Getting back to the week's events, the protests that have been taking place to commemorate the anniversary, and we're hearing also that a boy was, a 16-year-old was killed, the heavy security presence. What have you made of this week's events?
Well, on the 14th of February, as we know, it was the anniversary of the revolution, 2 years after the 14th of February, and the people went ahead with a lot of activism. They went in demonstrations, in protests in various parts of the country. They blocked the roads. They called for a national strike. But the response of the regime has been very harsh. We saw that thousands upon thousands of troops were stationed on that day in various roads, in almost every locality. The people found it almost impossible to congregate, yet they went out, and the 14-year-old boy, Hussein al-Jaziri, was martyred.
Okay, you know, the opposition, or parts of the opposition, are actually conducting talks, national reconciliation talks with the regime at the moment. What do you make of that? Because I know that you're somebody who believes in regime change rather than reform. If
the regime was reformable, I would have called for reforming the regime. But when we have opposed it for the past 45 years as a person, and then I realized that this regime couldn't be changed, then it would be folly of me to go and just ask for repetition of something that had already been tried and failed.
So you think al-Wifaq are making a mistake by talking to the regime?
I thought al-Wifaq would have been better advised if they stayed away and if they joined forces on the 14th with the people, although they are maintaining that we will keep up the struggle, and that is only a way of trying not to be blamed by the Western governments for not joining.
But what other route is there to national reconciliation and you know, saving the country other than, you know, talks?
Well, it is also a deception to talk about Bahrain in terms of social tension. There is no social tension except when the regime wanted it to be there. The problem in Bahrain is between the people and the ruling family, no one else. Of course, he introduced and shifted the blame on this social tension, but in reality, it knows before anyone else that there is no social tension.
But is the opposition divided? You know, some of them want to talk to the regime and reform, some of them want regime change. And is this division something that the regime can play with?
I'm sure that these are tactical matters. The regime is aware of that. Those who are calling for constitutional monarchy are as apparently far from achieving it as probably the others who are calling for the regime change, in the sense that they will face a lot of obstruction, especially from the West. But at the same time, I think the whole people of Bahrain want real change.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shahabi, for the moment. We will come back to you later. But the social media sites have been buzzing with talk of Bahrain as usual, and Nawal Mohammed has been looking at what Bahrainis have been saying this past week. So, Nawal, over to you.
Thank you, Roshan. Well, this week on our Facebook, we sent out a post asking you all to send us your messages for the second-year anniversary of the Bahraini Revolution. We got some interesting replies, and we've had to blur out some of the offensive language. Adil Mahmoud said, "You can't win a government by burning tires or throwing rubbish on the streets. Stop dreaming, wake up and stop this. Let's all stay in peace." Ahmed Mohammed replied to Adil saying, "I agree with you, but no matter how much we scream, these human rights defenders will still be calling these terrorists peaceful." On other social media sites, people have been tweeting about the various protests around the world that are in solidarity with the 2-year anniversary of the Bahraini Revolution. Shahab tweeted, "2 years ago, the brave people of Bahrain took to the streets and started their revolution. They did that then, but the regime is still crushing them." Bahraini police have used tear gas and stun grenades to disperse hundreds of protesters in Manama as they were marking the 2nd anniversary of the revolution against the ruling monarchy. Demonstrators tried to march towards Pearl Square at the center of peaceful protest 2 years ago, when demonstrations against the royal family first began. People have been posting pictures of the protests. Mark Owen Jones posted this photo of the protests in Bahrain, and Free Nabil Rajab posted this photo and said, "Another amazing shot of protesters from Bahrain heading to Pearl Roundabout." Mazin Mahdi tweeted about the amazing women of Bahrain who organize an all-women opposition protest. People were also quite angry about some of the sentences that the court ruled during the anniversary. Fatima Haji tweeted, "With or without dialogue, court stupidity won't stop. For the second time in 3 years, there's an imprisonment sentence for a dead boy. Mata Fadl Ubaidi was sentenced." Zahr Mahdi tweeted a picture about this and said, after killing him by shooting him at the head with a tear gas canister, they now sentence him to 3 years in prison. On a different note, Bahrain Air has halted all flights and will liquidate its assets. The struggling Middle East carrier blamed political unrest in the island kingdom and the government's refusal to pay its compensation. The privately owned airline, launched in 2008, offered about 110 regional flights to 18 destinations in the Middle East and Asia. Bahrain Air had 300 employees who have now all lost their jobs. That's all for social media this week, Roshan.
Okay, Nawal, thank you very much for the time being. Well, this show has been receiving anniversary messages on our voicemail system and also from people in Bahrain and London. So we've selected a few of them to show you now, and we'll start with the harrowing testimony of a teenage girl whose father was killed after the uprising. I should say that the following video contains graphic images, so viewer discretion is advised.
I'm the daughter of martyr Karim Fakhrawi, who was a famous businessman in Bahrain. On February 14, 2011, political events began in our country. Since these events happened, our house has been attacked by the Bahraini policemen. The second day after the attack has happened, my father went to the police station to report what has happened to our house. After that moment, we didn't hear any news about my father for 10 days. He has been arrested. At the 10th day, they called my dad's office and requested us to go to the Salmania hospital, where my father was taken there. Unfortunately, after spending a long time searching for my dad, we were shocked and surprised. They took my dad to the morgue. They killed him. The second day, before we take my dad's body to the cemetery, they had threatened my uncle with guns on his head not to post any pictures of my dad's body to the news or anywhere else. Luckily, the people who were there uncovered his body and took many pictures of his body and posted them on every social network to prove to the world that my dad has been killed and tortured to death, where bruises were covering all his body. Also a hole bleeding from his neck, and his teeth were broken also. However, my father is a peaceful man who has been killed and tortured to death, but his killers are unfortunately living freely until this moment. I ask all the people from all around the world to consider my dad's case and to help us get my dad's rights back.
I think a dialogue with the Al Khalifa regime is wrong. It's a futile attempt because the Al Khalifa have, as a ruling family, have lost their legitimacy and they no longer represent the people of Bahrain. And on this basis, I believe the only solution in Bahrain is for Al Khalifa to step down. Thank you.
After 2 years of revolution in Bahrain, we begin to see people are more determined to finish what they have really started. After all these violations and the crimes by this regime, people now are more clear that the change must come to Bahrain, and they are really determined to finish up what they have really started.
Today, after 2 years of the Bahrain people's uprising, they are much more stronger than they were 2 years ago, and they are much more willing to go forward to gain and regain their rights, their legitimate rights, even though the regime is using so much of force against the people, all these atrocities, but the people will not retreat from whatever they have been calling for. These days we can see much more people in the streets because they know that someday in the near future they will have their rights being regained.
Okay, let's take a brief look now at the other stories that have been making the headlines in Bahrain this week. The opening session of the so-called National Dialogue took place last Sunday. Although many details remain unclear, the opposition decided it should give the process a chance to deliver. An official spokesman of the National Dialogue said that they had agreed to meet twice a week, and the focus now rested on building bridges of trust between all parties. The Bahrain Center for Human Rights has reported that 3 jailed opposition figures, Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, Abdul Hadi al-Mukhadar and Abdul Jalil al-Singais, have started a hunger strike to protest against restrictions on communication. Al-Khawaja began his strike on the 2nd of February. Al-Mukhadar and al-Singais started on the 5th and the 7th of February, respectively. And finally, a conference was held in London to highlight the demolition of Shia mosques and other religious sites in Bahrain. Delegates said that around 50 mosques and other sites had been destroyed and copies of the Quran had been burned inside. The delegates blamed the austere brand of Islam known as Wahhabism, imported from Saudi Arabia, for the demolitions. But the Bahraini authorities say they've only demolished buildings which didn't have a license. Well, there was another major meeting of the Bahraini opposition in London this week, held at the House of Lords. Once again, the main topics were whether or not to dialogue with the regime and what the future holds for Bahrain. Here's more on that meeting. The House of Lords meeting was packed full of Bahraini dissidents who complained of physical harassment and said no meaningful political change had taken place in Bahrain since the start of the uprising 2 years ago.
But in the Gulf, including Bahrain, hereditary autocracies remain in power, supported by the UK and the US, the supposed champions of democracy.
We've been kept outside, like in this corridor, to wait to take us to the prosecutor. In this corridor was with me Sheikh Mohammed Habib Miqdad, Matar, ex-MP, Sheikh Abdul Azim Muhtadi, and some others. In this corridor, we've been tortured. Just a wall between that corridor and where the prosecutor is waiting to integrate me.
The delegates were split over whether the opposition should enter a national dialogue with the regime, but all seem pessimistic about the prospects for real change in the future.
The opposition's proposals for solution based on what? Based on fully demanding the democracy, based on the elected government, based on one man, one vote, based on independency of judiciary system, based on the security for all, based on, I can say that, based on mainly a justice for everyone.
The Bahraini opposition says that if dialogue fails, the people will remain in the streets for the foreseeable future. But they say they're determined not to commit the mistakes of the Syrian opposition, to militarize the conflict, to get foreign powers involved, and to thus destroy the country. Dr. Said Shahabi, if I could come straight to you and ask you your personal opinion, what does the future hold for Bahrain?
Well, the future should be bright because we have had enough darkness that has lasted for too long. And I do not think the laws of nature allow a very, very long period of darkness. After darkness, we will always have some rays of hope, and this is what we are waiting for, because the people are determined, and the regime has lost almost all its cards. It has really lost the legitimacy to remain and to exist. So I think it has to go.
But you say it's lost all its cards. It has 2 major cards, doesn't it? Saudi support and Western support.
Well, dictatorships cannot remain forever dependent on outside support. You are right in the sense that the only way the regime is now standing on its feet is because of the supporting mechanisms offered by the UK and Saudi Arabia. Remove these two and it has fallen. In fact, it fell 2 years ago when the people went on the streets. But usually dictators go. Usually people remain.
But if you can't change the position of the West and Saudi Arabia, how is this revolution going to succeed? Can the people overthrow the Khalifas on their own?
I think none of those dictators who have been brought down came down because of the Western decision. The West would rather keep these dictators. It will never support any people to bring down these dictators. So I don't think the West is instrumental in bringing down dictatorship. In fact, it is instrumental in propping up dictatorships. So the people will rely on themselves, but they will create new realities and new dynamics by which the West will have no alternative but to acquiesce to the demand of the people.
I mean, over 2 years, the Bahraini revolution has, by and large, remained peaceful. Do you fear that if the frustration grows, that at some stage it's going to get violent, it's going to become militarized?
It seems to me that the opposite will happen, because the regime is becoming more violent. And as we saw 2 days ago, during the 14th February anniversary, the people were going in the streets in a peaceful way. Yet the regime had to use shotguns to kill a 14-year-old young man, Hussein al-Jaziri. So it is the people know that with their patience, with their blood, they will achieve victory. The regime knows that the longer it continues passively, the more likelihood that it will fall. And this is why it is resorting to violence, extreme forms of violence. We expect more violence by the regime, more torture, more imprisonment, more demolition of mosques. So everything that happened in the past 2 years will again happen. And this is for the West to decide whether it is moral for them to keep supporting this dictatorship.
Is there any room for the Al-Khalifas in a future Bahrain?
Well, for them as citizens, nobody will expel them from Bahrain. But for them to continue holding the guns on the heads of the people, I think the time has gone. And I don't think any citizen, even those who have gone to dialogue, their aim is not to keep the Al-Khalifa in the same position. Their aim is to nationalize all aspects, including police, judiciary, security, army, and intelligence. All these 5 sectors must be nationalized and must be run by the people, because they have been exploited, misused by the regime, by the Al-Khalifa. They must not, no utility in the country must be kept solely for the use or control by the Al-Khalifa.
What, I mean, you obviously believe in change, you hope for change, that is part of your work, and you must believe in that. But realistically, given the geopolitics and everything else that's going on in the country, what do you think the time scale for change will be? Are we looking at a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years?
In my generation, in my lifetime, I saw, and I was part of, in one way or another, the downfall of the Shah, the downfall of Saddam Hussein, the downfall of Hosni Mubarak, the downfall of Gaddafi, the downfall of Ali Abdullah Saleh, the downfall of Ben Ali. And the activists in almost all these countries were friends of mine, and I was at one stage or another part of these people. Now, you are telling me that the weakest of these regimes will remain forever, while all those strong regimes, what appear to be strong regimes, have gone. I believe within the next 5 years, this regime will not remain.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Shahabi, for sharing your expertise and your thoughts with us today. That's all the time we do have for today, and thanks again to Dr. Shahabi and, of course, to my colleague Nawal Mohammed. Well, that's it for this series of Inside Bahrain. I hope over the last few weeks we've been able to throw a spotlight on the political events in the country, events which are much neglected in the media but could be pivotal to the whole Persian Gulf region. From all the team on Inside Bahrain, bye-bye.